Today we're back in my parents' 1915 home and we're tackling this Pepto Bismol pink dining room. Now I know some people love pink and love this pink in particular, but honestly it's kind of my least favorite color. I'd much prefer a bold red rather than a pink. But before I got started by paint or anything here, I started with skim coating because all of the walls in this house have this really rough texture that feels like sandpaper and I hate it. And I just like to use a thin down joint compound, slap it on with a taping knife, scrape it off. This is a pretty simple project. It is just labor intensive. So if you're planning to skim coat a room, just be prepared to spend a lot of time on it, maybe get an audiobook or two. And here's how I mix up my new skim coat compound. So I'll take some all-purpose compound because it's cheaper. It comes in this bag in this box. You have to pull it out, move it into a bucket, and then I add in about a cup of water and I use a mixer attachment on my drill to get that all nice and blended in. Then I finish up this skim coat in here, let it dry, and then the worst part of it, in my opinion, is the sanding. Some people will hand sand a skim coat, but I just find that using an orbital sander gets you the best possible finish. And if you hook it up to a shop vac like this, it just removes a lot of that dust, which is really nice because drywall is disgustingly dusty. Then before I prime or paint anything, I dust the walls and I just use this little floor mop and get it wet and then rub it along the walls and it picks up a lot of that nasty dust. Once it gets kind of clogged, I'll go rinse it off and then keep going along the wall. And then once that was completely dry, I got started with priming. And for the primer in here, because I didn't want it to splatter onto that shiplap wall, I used a foam pad instead to apply the primer. And that was also really nice because you can kind of lazily cut in around edges without having to pull out a brush to do that instead. So here's the before and here is the after of this skim coat. You can see what the textured walls looked like before and what they look like now. Completely smooth. Now in addition to paint, the other thing I wanted to tackle in here is this built-in hutch. This is original to the house, but it needs some TLC. You can see that all the hardware has been painted over, and that's always a shame because hardware is kind of the jewelry of a room. So to strip the paint off these, I started by using some citrus strip on the screws. That just allows me to then come back a couple days later, dig my screwdriver into the screw slots and be able to remove those screws. Now, when I removed this hardware, you can also see that originally this built-in was that shellacked wood finish that's really beautiful, and someone then came in and painted over it later. You can also see that this top layer of paint comes off suspiciously easily, and that is because someone took a latex-based paint, which is water-based, and put it over that oil-based paint underneath. So it just peels right off. It did not form a bond, which is not great. And if I had a bunch of time and a lot of patience, I would completely strip down this entire built-in, but I didn't have that time or patience with this project. So I'll show you how I put a band-aid on this instead. Now that I can remove the hinges, I also removed the doors, got them down, and then some of them were coming apart at the seams. So I just used some wood glue, pushed it into the cracks, and then used a clamp to get those pieces nice and tight again, removed all the excess glue. And then here's where the band-aid comes in. I'm just sanding off any of the loose paint and leaving the paint behind that has a good bond. And then for the trim, I'll use an alkyd paint, which is latex based but has oil enhanced properties in it, so it can bond better to an oil-based paint than a normal latex-based paint can. In the meantime, I started stripping all of the hardware by putting it into my nice lead paint crock pot. I just put it in there with water and some Dawn soap and put it on low and let it get to work. Then after a few days, I'll come back, completely turn it off, let it cool down, and start removing the hardware. And you can see for some of these pieces, the paint is already just falling off, which is really nice. But for the more stubborn bits, I'll get them all cleaned up in the sink with a brass brush, and you can see it removed all of that excess paint. But the issue with this hardware, just like the hardware in my house, is that it's not the most expensive. Whoever built this house used brass plated hardware instead of solid brass. And you can see that the brass plating is coming off, and it was probably starting to rust, which is why someone painted over it originally. And if you're not sure if your hardware is solid or plated brass, you can use a magnet. A magnet does not stick to solid brass, but anything that is brass plated, it will stick to. But you can see here that these doorknobs that someone had painted over were solid brass. But for all these plated pieces, I'm essentially plating them again by using some rub and buff to get them all to a nice golden, beautiful color, and then sealing them with some spray paint enamel just to make sure that rub and buff stays put. While all of that dried, I started working on paint colors. So I wanted these walls to be really off-white and creamy, and for the trim to just be even creamier because my mom has a lot of colorful decor, and I wanted this to be kind of a neutral backdrop. But I can't just do like a white and beige room. It really bothers me. So we had to do a pop of color in here, and I decided to do it on the ceiling to match the patina green paint on the shiplap wall here, which I also protected with some plastic because I did use a roller to paint this room and rollers splatter, and I did not want it on this 100-year-old wood. I started with my creamy wall color and then the even creamier trim color. Then I painted the ceiling this beautiful green. I also painted the crown molding to match. And just for friendly reminder that if you're painting a ceiling, it is very messy and it will splatter down all over you, including on your glasses, so be prepared for that. Of course, I had to paint the vent cover to match the ceiling because I love to camouflage, and then I cleaned up this line between the wall and the crown molding just to make that really sharp and crisp. I removed all the plastic, got the floors cleaned up, did a little bit of decorating in the hutch just because I wanted to see it styled, and here's a reminder of this room before and after. It's so much brighter and more cheerful in here, and yes, I know these walls look bare now, they do to me too, but my mom again has a ton of decor. It's going to go all over here. She also plans to have a very colorful ceiling light, so I do feel like keeping things neutral in here was the right decision, and I love that the ceiling matches that shiplap wall so well. I'm also really proud of how the hutch turned out. I mean, obviously, yes, as we talked about, it was putting a band-aid on a bigger problem, but hey, you know what? That paint is sticking really well now, and the hardware looks so good. So that is the finished room for now. It feels so good to have a room in here actually finally done, in quotation marks. Obviously, it will still have lighting. My parents will bring in their furniture, but it's one room I can finally check off my list.